Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome back to the Xils Lab Xils 4 tutorial series. Time to tackle probably the most complex module in the Xils 4 today, the sequencer. If you're enjoying this series and you want to help support my channel, check out the Patreon and channel member links below. That's a great way to do it. Okay, let's get underway. I'm going to press the sequencer tab in the additional modules section, and that's going to reveal this split interface. Basically, this whole panel is now the sequencer. But as you'd expect with a modular synthesizer, it's not going to do anything until we tell it what to do. Bear in mind at the moment, I've got a very simple patch set up here. I am going through the filter, but other than that, it's a really straightforward single oscillator sound using the left-hand synthesizer. And I've got my standard keyboard connections, which means when I press keys on the keyboard, we're going to hear those sounds. That's not the normal behavior for a sequencer. We're going to decouple that because we're going to hand control of generating the tones to the sequencer. The keyboard is going to trigger the sequencer. The sequencer is going to make sound. This is a critical distinction. So these pins, which we almost never touch in the keyboard module, in the keyboard matrix, we're going to throw them away. And so obviously now, pressing keys on the keyboard, you're not going to hear any sound. Now there are two different ways that you can interact with the sequencer when you're programming it. The first one is like an emulation of the original equipment. We've got this layer knob and a record toggle switch. If I toggle that switch down, it's now in record mode. And if I press keys on the keyboard, it's going to input them into the sequencer. The problem is it's really clunky. We will have a little bit of a look at it later, but I'm actually not going to use that for recording any data in today's episode. Instead, I'm going to use this graphical interface at the top. It's just better. It's an easier, more intuitive way to input data. So I essentially recommend that you never worry about these controls again, but I will show you a little bit later how they work. Before I actually input any data, a quick word about what the sequencer is. It's essentially 6 pairs of independent sequencers. So really you've got 6 sequencers in one. Each of these pairs is called a layer. And as you can see, we've got layer 1, 2, and 3. Now the naming convention for these 6 controls isn't consistent in the interface. Down at the bottom we've got A, B, C, D, E, F, and up at the top left hand corner you can see that that's repeated. But at other places in the sequence we see A, B, A, B, A, B. Down here that's effectively A, B, C, D, E, F as I'm running down with my mouse. So I'm going to have to be a little bit careful when I'm talking about A's and B's as to exactly what I mean, because we've got this kind of slightly confused terminology. For the moment, I'm only going to concentrate on layer 1, so I'm concentrating on a single sequencer pair. And right at the outset, just the first range. So this is basically sequence number 1. Up in the interface at the top of the screen, we can view all 6 sequencers simultaneously, but because we're only interested in dealing with one of them, I'm going to disable the other 5. So now we can only see sequence number 1. But if I try to click on this thing to input notes, you can see that it's not allowing me to. I need to enter edit mode, and sure enough, that's how we do that. So now if I click in this interface, I will insert a note, and you can see this red line's appeared. Now by default, the range of the sequencer goes effectively 0 to 100%, in other words, the entire frequency range. You can zoom in to get a better look at it. Sometimes these notes don't always refresh. Can you see in this view, we're not actually seeing that red line at the moment. You'll see this a couple of times during today's episode, that the updating of this graphical interface isn't completely consistent. I'm going to stay in the mini mode because at least we can see the notes here. So every time I click here, you can see that I'm inserting the note. These are all left clicks. If I right click, I'm going to delete the event that I've just created. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit further to make my keyboard slightly bigger, and I'm going to enter C3. Just to get us up and running, I'm going to enter an 8-note sequence. So we'll have an E and a G, and then down to E, and let's have a G, up to C, and then maybe a G at the end. So there's our 8-note sequence. Now we need to figure out how to get the synthesizer to play those notes. Well, when I press a key on the keyboard, I want the sequencer to start, and when I let go of the key, I want the sequencer to stop. So let's zoom into our keyboard matrix, and I'll show you how to do that. Keyboard on is going to trigger the sequencer to start, and keyboard gate has a slightly unusual behavior as far as the sequencer is concerned. It effectively acts like a keyboard off. So it's still the gate command, it's still doing the same job, but actually when we close the gate, in other words, release the key, it sends the signal to sequence off. So that's going to be how we start and stop the sequence. The sequence still isn't actually doing any work. It's not actually triggering anything. Still a couple of things that we need to do. In this center of the 3 pin matrices in the sequencer itself, this is where we configure triggers. So layer 1, which is the one that we've just configured, needs to trigger trapezoid number 1, which is the left-hand synthesizer. So if I connect those two together, now the layer is firing the envelope. The last connection I need to make is where we configure layer 1 of the sequencer to control the oscillator frequency. So now when I press a single note on the keyboard, it's going to start this sequence, which basically in the background is virtually playing all the keys of this sequence. All those keys of that sequence need to do something. They need to manipulate the oscillator frequency in exactly the same way as any individual keyboard press would do from our standard additional matrix. So this is how the physical keyboard itself interacts with the oscillator frequency, and that's still important, but the sequencer itself needs to be able to do that job internally, and so we wire it to the oscillator frequency as well. And finally, with all of those different pins connected, I can press a single note on the keyboard, and I've not set my slew to 0. This is basically like an internal portamento. Let's set that down to 0. Ooh, spurious D sharp. We don't want that. Right click, turn it into an E. Okay, so there's our C major arpeggio. I'm just going to review that because that's pretty complex stuff. I'm pressing a key on the keyboard. The keyboard is triggering the sequencer via our keyboard matrix. When the sequencer starts, it starts basically scanning through its note table, and at the moment it's an 8-note sequence. I'll show you how to manipulate that shortly. Each one of these red lines corresponds to a different control voltage that the sequencer is going to output. It has a clock rate. Our clock rate is set down here. We haven't looked at that yet, but here it is, and you can see if I hover over this center knob, it's currently cycling at 6 Hertz. Each one of these control voltages wants to do 2 different jobs. The first thing it needs to do is trigger the trapezoid envelope of the synthesizer, basically open the gate to allow information to get through our matrix. We're still connected to exactly the same matrix. The trapezoid is going to instruct oscillator 1 to send a signal to the filter, etc., etc. Ultimately, that's going to get to the outside world, and that connection is made via our layer matrix. So this is where we connect layer 1 to trapezoid 1. So in this context, trapezoid 1 is the left-hand synthesizer, trapezoid 2 is the right-hand synthesizer, which we've not done anything with yet. And finally, each one of these control voltages needs to be instructed to do some work. In the case of layer A, which is the one that we've configured, it's manipulating the oscillator frequency. So I'm only pressing a single key on the keyboard. The left-hand synthesizer's pin matrix is centering that note on the C that I've pressed, but then the sequencer is also adding its control voltage into the mix. And so we're getting all of these different modulations of that base control voltage to change the pitch of the oscillator. Now let's have a look at this twin nature of dual sequencers running simultaneously, because layer 1 has 2 sequencers and we've only configured range A, which is the one at the top of this interface. If we switch over to range B, and I'm going to disable A now so that we can't even see the notes that are being played anymore. Now we configure a new sequence, and these 2 sequences are going to run side by side. They're going to generate the same triggers to the outside world. So you've only got one means of configuring layer 1 to speak to the outside world. But we're going to get range B, in other words, the second control of this pair, to do a different job. We're going to have it output its control voltages to the filter, the cutoff filter of the left-hand synthesizer. For this job, because we're no longer dealing in notes, I'm going to zoom back out of my sequencer matrix so that I can input effectively pure control voltages. And I'm just going to draw, it's a little bit difficult to see, but there are actually kind of dark orange lines being drawn in the sequencer here. and I'm just going to draw a triangle. So I'm going up and then I'm coming back down. So while that 8-note sequence is played, these different control voltages are totally arbitrary values. I've just picked random values. Are going to increase in voltage up to step 5 and then come back down again. These control voltages are going to be output to the control cutoff, the filter cutoff of the left-hand synthesizer. That's why I put this filter in the circuit so that I could demonstrate this today. And now basically we need to salt these control voltages to taste. I don't know what they're going to do yet. I'm going to press a key and find out. That's actually not bad. I can now manipulate the cutoff frequency to get the effect that I wanted. If that range wasn't quite big enough, I could go back into the sequencer and change the events there, or I could activate the amount times 4 and effectively spread those control voltages across a wider range of the filter. Let's hear what that sounds like. Now this first one is too low and it's pulled the cutoff too far down. Now we can't hear it anymore. Let's see if I can find a usable range. Not really. The ranges are too wide as input for X4 to be doing any work. That's okay. Let's throw it away. That's a pretty good filter sweep. So that's an example of 2 different completely independent sequences. In other words, the control voltages, the 8 control voltages of those 2 sequences have got nothing to do with each other, but they are tied together and they're being output to the same destination. In this case, trapezoid 1, to trigger the envelope, to open the gate so that we can hear the sound. We could also tie range B to the output volume. So let's connect those pins as well. So now, in addition to it increasing and decreasing the cutoff range, cutoff frequency, it's going to do exactly the same job to the output level. So it's going to get loudest at step 5. Now let's have a play with the speed of the sequence. Everything up until now has been at 6 Hz. The center knob of this, basically like split control, controls the frequency of the sequence. And we can sync it using the tempo sync switch. So now we're at tempo times 3. We can increase or decrease the number of steps from the outer ring of this clock dial. So I'm basically going to pick it up, click anywhere in the outer ring, and as I drag down, I decrease the number of steps, and as I drag up, I increase the number of steps. I'm going to switch back to look at view A because the notes of the sequence are a little bit more intuitive than the kind of random frequency filter cutoff values. So here's our sequence back again. I'm going to decouple the keyboard gate from sequence off. So now when I press a note, it'll start, but it won't stop. Here we go. Now, every time I press a new note on the keyboard, I'm going to press this note multiple times. See, I'm not really interacting with the sequence in any way. I can manually stop it by pressing the stop button, which is effectively what this sequence off is mapped to. It's mapped to this stop button. The start button is mapped to the start. There we go. So if I want it to re-trigger this sequence, basically start the sequence from the beginning every time I press a new key, I can do that by mapping keyboard on to sequence reset. And now let's get it running. Press a new key. I'll press a G. So the reason why that's now playing new offsets is because that key command, that keyboard control voltage that's being supplied from the keyboard is intrinsically connected. These notes aren't, the notes of the sequence aren't the be-all and end-all of the story. If my keyboard command, the note that I'm pressing on my physical keyboard, that's mapped to oscillator frequency, this connection is still live. So it's the combination of these pins controlling the fundamental frequency of the oscillator and these pins in the sequence controlling the additional relative control voltage offset of the sequence. Together, they're doing work. If I wanted to decouple the keyboard entirely and have the sequence and the sequence alone be responsible for manipulating the frequency, I can decouple the pins in the left-hand synthesizer, and now every note that I press on the keyboard is going to play the same sequence. So I'll press a random D sharp. You can hear how high those native control voltages are. Let's play another note anywhere. Doesn't really matter. Every note that I play on the keyboard is having exactly the same effect on the sound. If I wanted to drop the frequency of all of those notes, I could do it from the oscillator. So let's knock the oscillator to -1, set the sequence going. Now it's playing an octave lower, or 2 octaves lower, I think. Yeah, there's a 2 octave span there. Reconnect the keyboard's control voltage modulation, and we're back to where we started. So now every note I press on the keyboard is going to center the sequence from that initial control voltage. I'll reconnect my gate to sequence off, and as you can hear, that actually shut the sequence down itself. But once again, I'm now in manual control. There's my pressing the keyboard down, and there's me letting the key go. The reset pin in the keyboard matrix is effectively the same as this reset button here. So if I've got the sequence running and physically press the reset button, it does exactly the same job. At this point, we know enough about how the sequence is working for me to show you this manual recording input. Even though I don't use it, I will show you how it works. I'm going to enable record, and I need to disengage continuous mode. I don't want the sequence to just start playing the moment I press a key. I want to put it in step mode, and that means that when I press this key, we're only going to step on one step. Now what's actually going to happen is that the note that's going to be input is going to be one step after this white line, which indicates the current step. The note that I press is going to be input into step number 3. So I'm going to press a C sharp. Well, that's awkward, isn't it? I had sequence reset still engaged. So you need to disengage that as well, otherwise it's going to set you back to the beginning. Okay, now it's going to input step number 2. I'll press an F sharp. There it is. And here's our G that's going to go into step 3. And now every key that I press on the keyboard is going to automatically increase the sequencer by 1 step. And it's going to input the note, whatever I play. That was a nice little demonstration of why I don't particularly like using this method, because it's so easy to forget a single thing and everything in the sequencer is still hooked up. So it's really easy to forget one connection that you've got that's going to have an impact that you're not anticipating. The one advantage of using this record mode is that actually it's doing 2 separate things. Only one of them's immediately obvious because we're looking at range A, but it's actually recording velocity information into range B. These dark orange lines that you see are the relative velocities of those notes that I played. So I'll now run through a sequence of 8 notes, playing initially very softly and then press harder. And there you can see the velocity stepping up. So it is handy if you want to get into that. By all means, that's why I've showed you. You know, it might be something that you're interested in using. Personally, I don't use this record mode. I would rather input the notes into the sequencer physically. It's just easier for me to work that way. Let's have a look at views A and B simultaneously. And now you can see, because I pressed the same note 8 times, I've reset my sequence information. Just had to stop the demo there and fix a mistake that I made. I wanted to re-input the notes into step A, but I had edit mode set to B. So I'm just going to flip over to A and now input the notes properly. Doesn't really matter what notes. Let's just get 8 new notes input into the sequence. And let's have a quick look at those 2 together. So back to continuous mode. And there's there's our sequence up and running again. Doesn't sound exactly like it used to, because I've just re-input new filter values. Let's make it go backwards. You can see now the step indicator moving backwards. One shot, it's just going to play the sequence once. Now as things stand, that note's going to hang because this envelope is an ADSR. While I've got the key down, the note's going to carry on playing. If I switch to trapezoid mode instead and manipulate I don't want any off, I don't want it to loop. Remember, the off switch set fully clockwise makes the trapezoid envelope not loop. There we go. And now, even though I've still got this note held down, we don't have that infinite sustain from the ADSR. So you are still intrinsically linked into the same synthesizer. You need to understand how the synthesizer works, but fundamentally, that sequence is only played once now, and it's up to us to determine what happens if we just sit there with the key held down. Switch back to ADSR so that I'm back in familiar territory. Erase event is basically just going to delete the event that you're currently looking at. So if you can see all of these different notes in the sequence, if I press erase event, everything's going to disappear, but only actually one note's been deleted. Here we go. They've all disappeared, but I'll press the sequence. You can see they all come back, so I think that's just an interface issue. I basically don't bother with these erase commands because I'm interacting with the graphical interface intrinsically. So that's how I'm gonna edit individual events. Erase all is useful if you want to throw everything away, and it will ask you to confirm that that's what you want to do. And now all of that event data's gone. The next demo I'm going to give you is going to introduce the right-hand synth so we can see the two synthesizers doing different jobs. And I'm actually going to use a preset for this because it's just going to be much faster to get up and running in the Xils 4 factory library. I'm going to open this preset called Underrun. I'll press a note on the keyboard so we can hear it. Okay, so there's a lot going on there. I don't particularly want to deconstruct the entire preset, but I want to draw your attention to the fact that the two different synthesizers, left and right, are doing different jobs. Let's have a listen to just the left-hand synthesizer first. We can use the left-right knob at the bottom of the interface. So that's the note-based sequence, and on the right-hand side, basically rhythmic filter pulses. So how's that being accomplished? Well, simply by sending the different commands to different locations. Let's have a look at the left-hand synth first. So this is trap 1. It's layer 2, this middle pair of sequences that are actually configured to go to the left-hand synthesizer. So let's have a look at what layer 2 is doing. Well, the top of the two commands, and this is where it's a little bit confusing, layer 2A is actually range C. It's this knob that I'm circling with my mouse. So this is the one that's controlling the frequency of the oscillators. The lower command, which is B, layer 2B, is going to the output. So that's controlling output levels. Let's see each of those in turn. So here are the notes. Oops. Switch back to the left-hand synth. You can quite clearly see that those purple marks indicate the control voltages that are translated into notes. And for layer D, which is the lower of this pair, all of these control voltages are controlling the level of the output. So if I arbitrarily overwrite some of these and have it really quiet at the end of the sequence, quite clearly see what's going on there. So that's one pair of layers doing two different jobs, just like in the demo that we looked at earlier. On the right-hand side, which is trap 2, you can see that that's configured to layer 1. So now it's this pair of controls, layer 1, that's outputting some control voltage information to the right-hand synth. Well, configuration of the modulation outputs to the right-hand synth is controlled in this matrix. So here's our left and right matrix control outputs. Instead of talking to oscillator frequency, which is your standard route 1, I want these things to affect notes or oscillator frequency. Frequency and volume we understand completely, but the right-hand matrix isn't mapped to oscillator frequency at all. It's only controlling filter cutoff and output level. So the sound that the right-hand synthesizer is generating is fundamentally a percussion-based sound, and the sequence is only affecting the filter cutoff. So let's have a look at layer 1A. These red notes are now outputting to the filter cutoff. And they're also, it's quite difficult to see these lines because they're, again, kind of a dark browny orange, but they're mirroring the filter cutoff control. Turn them both on at the same time. See, they're having a very similar effect. So we're turning up the volume and we're turning up the filter cutoff frequency. If I edit those filter cutoffs and bring them low instead, now we've got fuddy tones, bright tones. So we've got two different pairs of sequencers going to two different synthesizers. The layer 1 pair is routed to the right-hand synthesizer, and the layer 2 pair is routed to the left-hand synthesizer. The final thing that I haven't mentioned yet is that each of these sequence knobs also has a range value. Now by default they're set to 100, which is about 11 o'clock on the dial. You can see it's about there. That means that any control voltages output are going to map chromatically. So if you set notes in your sequencer and you're expecting them to output pitched tunes, set your range to 100. So if we use the left-hand synth, that's the tonal one for this particular preset, and we're dealing with layer 2, which is the one that's connected to the notes-based sound of the sequence. So we're currently at 100. If I increase this range, the sequence is basically, those notes are going to stretch out. Here we go. So that's as recorded. Control voltages are being spread out according to this range. That stands to reason if I pull it all the way down to 0. Now all of the control voltages are outputting exactly the same signal, and we're basically just hearing the native tone of the oscillator. So I'm not going to lie, pretty complex module, an awful lot to learn. I recommend you dive into the presets, have a wander around them, and try to get some tips on how to program it from them. But it's just one of those things where you've really got to dive in and start playing with it, and eventually you do start figuring out these pairs of sequencers and how they're supposed to be mapped to the rest of the synthesizer. Hope you enjoyed the episode. Please hit like if you did. I'll see you next time. Thanks very much.